The bulldozer's diesel engine was still ticking when she said it, standing there in her white blazer with a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. "It's just a pile of rocks, Mr. Hatch. Nobody owns a view of a lake. Nobody owns rocks that have been sitting there since the Ice Age." That was Marlene Cutter, president of the Alpine Basin Homeowners Association, standing on my great-grandfather's moraine 40 minutes after her contractor packed it with enough ANFO to open a highway through the Rockies. Behind her, 12 new lots sat staked out with pink survey flags, each one marketed as premium lakefront, unobstructed views, each one already carrying a $40,000 non-refundable view premium on top of the base price. Do the math, 12 lots, 40 grand each, that's $480,000 in premiums alone. And that's before you count the $3.2 million in total pre-sale deposits Cutter's shell company had already banked on homes that didn't exist yet, on land that come spring would not exist either. I didn't say a word to her that day. I just took out my phone and I filmed the crater where 200 feet of glacial till used to sit, packed tight by 10,000 years of pressure, holding back 40 acres of meltwater lake above 300 homes below. By the time the thaw came that April, the numbers would flip on her completely. Not $3.2 million in profit, try $11.4 million in liability, 7 felony counts, and a restitution order that would strip every asset she'd hidden behind that LLC down to the furniture. And almost none of it, I want you to really sit with that, almost none of it would be for the rocks she blew up. It would be for what she didn't know was sitting in a filing cabinet in my equipment shed. Survey pins, federal flood maps, and 40 years of my own engineering signature on documents proving that moraine wasn't scenery. It was a dam. A legal, deeded, federally recognized flood control structure, on my land. She thought she was clearing a view. She was pulling the pin on a hand grenade and calling it landscaping. My name's Robert Hatch. Everybody calls me Bob, except my late wife, who called me Robert when she was mad and Bobby when she wasn't, which tells you most of what you need to know about my marriage, and none of what you need to know about what happened up on that mountain. I'm 63 years old. I spent 38 of those years as a geotechnical engineer, mostly working on earthen dams and levee systems for the Bureau of Reclamation, and later private outfits doing failure analysis after things went wrong. I've stood in the mud after a tailings pond let go in Colorado. I've walked the crown of a failed levee in Louisiana 3 days after Katrina, counting bodies of houses instead of people, thank God. I know what water does when something stops holding it back. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about your clipboard. But before I was any of that, I was just a Hatch. And the Hatch family has been sitting on Miller's Basin since 1888, when my great-grandfather Ansel Hatch homesteaded 420 acres at the base of what the old-timers just called the Wall. Ansel didn't know the technical term for it. Nobody did back then. He just knew that the pile of stone and packed gravel running along the ridge kept the snowmelt lake up top from coming down all at once and drowning his cattle every spring. He built his cabin below it, planted his orchard below it, and when he died in 1931, he left the whole basin to his son with one line in the will, written in pencil, that my father used to read to me like scripture. Never touch the wall. It keeps us alive. I never touched it. Neither did my father, Delbert Hatch, who ran cattle on that land until 1988 and left it to me with the same warning. Except by then we had a name for the wall. Geologists came through in the 60s doing survey work and identified it as a terminal glacial moraine, a natural dam essentially, 210 feet thick at its base, formed over 11,000 years by a retreating glacier. In 1974, the county engineer's office, working off federal flood mapping requirements, formally classified it as a flood control feature protecting the basin below. That classification sat quietly in a filing cabinet in the county annex for 50 years, gathering dust, because nobody ever had a reason to look at it. Until Marlene Cutter needed lake views to sell. My house sits about a quarter mile below where the moraine used to run, an old ranch house my grandfather built with his own hands in 1934. Cottonwood beams, a hand-hewn dining table from 1899 that Ansel built himself. The surface still stained dark in one corner where 3 generations of hatchmen set down hot coffee cups without a coaster, because nobody in this family has ever cared much about table manners. My wife's been gone 6 years now, buried up on the hill next to my parents and my grandparents. 4 generations of hatch graves looking out over the basin. When the wind comes down off the mountain in the evening, it carries the smell of cut hay and diesel from my old tractor, and underneath that, if you know what you're smelling for, the mineral cold breath of glacial water. I've smelled it my whole life. It smells like home. It smelled, that April, like something else entirely. Marlene Cutter didn't grow up smelling any of that. She showed up in Miller's Basin 11 years ago, bought a lot from the original small development up top, got herself elected HOA president within 2 years by promising to modernize the community, and drove a leased Range Rover that she replaced every 18 months. Always white, always spotless, like she was worried dust might reveal something about her. She wore blazers to HOA meetings the way other people wear armor, carried a clipboard she rarely looked at, and had a way of talking to homeowners like they were slightly slow children who just needed things explained one more time, a little louder. What most of Miller's Basin didn't know, what I didn't fully know myself until I started digging, was that Marlene had quietly formed a development company 2 years earlier called Blue Water Ridge Holdings LLC, registered out of state, with herself listed as a consultant rather than an owner. A paperwork trick that kept her name one legal step removed from the very lots the HOA was approving for sale. She'd been buying up unsold parcels through the shell company, then using her HOA authority to approve community improvements that happened to increase the value of exactly the lots Blue Water Ridge owned. The moraine, 200 feet of ancient stone sitting between 12 of those lots and a clean, unbroken view of Miller's Lake, was, to her, simply the last obstacle between a $480,000 premium payday and a much bigger one waiting behind it. She just didn't know whose dam she was standing on. The notice came by certified mail on a Tuesday, 2:47 p.m., same as it always did, because Wanda Pruitt has driven that rural route for 22 years, and you could set your watch by her Ford Ranger coming up the county road. I remember the time because I'd started writing it down. Every piece of mail from the Alpine Basin HOA, every knock on my door, every conversation with Marlene Cutter went into a yellow legal pad I kept on the hand-hewn table Ansel built. Time, date, what was said, who said it. 38 years of engineering work teaches you that documentation is the only thing standing between you and somebody else's version of the truth. That particular letter, dated March 3rd, informed me that I was in violation of something called the Basin Vista View Corridor Easement, recorded, it claimed, in 1998, granting the Alpine Basin HOA the right to maintain unobstructed sightlines to Miller's Lake across affected parcels, including natural formations impeding development value. The fine was $500 a day, retroactive to January 1st, which came out to just over $31,000 already owed, with a note that continued non-compliance would result in a lien against my property. I read it twice at my kitchen table, with the smell of coffee going cold in front of me, and I laughed, because in 38 years of reading engineering reports and legal filings, I have never once seen anyone try to claim a homeowners association had an easement over an 11,000-year-old glacial formation for the crime of existing. I drove up to the HOA office that Thursday. It's a double-wide trailer they'd fixed up nice, vinyl siding, a little covered porch, sitting at the entrance to the new development. Marlene was there in a cream-coloured pantsuit this time, not the white blazer, standing behind a desk with that same clipboard, like she slept with the thing. "Mr. Hatch," she said, before I'd even gotten a word out, "I understand you're upset, but the corridor easement is a matter of record. You can look it up at the county clerk's office if you don't believe me." "I will," I said. What I want to know is, who recorded a view easement over land my family's owned since 1888 without ever contacting my family? She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided you're an inconvenience rather than a problem. The prior board recorded it in '98, before your father passed. It's not something I did personally, I just enforce what's on the books. Then she tapped her clipboard, glanced at a thin gold watch, and said, "The engineering firm's coming Monday to do a site assessment on the ridge. Standard procedure before any corrective action." Corrective action. I wrote that phrase down in the truck before I even started the engine, along with the time, 11:14 a.m., and the fact that she'd called a 200-foot Glacial Moraine a corrective action site. I sent everything to my lawyer, an old ranching dispute attorney named Carl Voss out of Gunnison, who'd handled water rights cases longer than Marlene had been alive. I photographed the letter, the postmark, the certified mail receipt. I photographed the survey stakes the HOA crew had already planted along the base of the moraine, pink flags fluttering in a March wind that still had snow in it. I documented the exact date the blasting permit application was filed with the county. I got that through a records request, 4 days before the crew showed up with their truck full of ANFO. And I noted, in my own handwriting, that no one from the HOA, the county, or anyone else had ever contacted me, the deeded owner of record, about detonating explosives on my land. Here's what most homeowners don't know. An HOA's authority, even a legitimate one, generally extends only to the common areas and lots explicitly covered under its recorded covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and under most state statutes, including Colorado's Common Interest Ownership Act at CRS Section 38-33.3-217, any claimed easement affecting a specific parcel has to be properly recorded against that parcel's chain of title, not just referenced in HOA meeting minutes or board resolutions. If your name isn't on the easement, and the easement isn't recorded against your specific deed with your knowledge, it may not be worth the paper it's printed on, no matter how official it looks on HOA letterhead. That Monday, the crew came anyway. I watched them from my porch with a pair of my late father's binoculars, 3 trucks, a mini excavator, and 2 men in hard hats setting charges along a stretch of the moraine that sat, according to my own survey pins, entirely inside the northern boundary of my 420 acres. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line at 1:52 p.m. and reported it. A deputy named Ruiz told me he'd send someone out, but by the time a patrol car came up the county road, it was 2:51 p.m. and the moraine wasn't there anymore. The blast went off at 2:47 p.m. I felt it before I heard it. A pressure in my chest like somebody had pushed on my sternum. And then the sound rolled down the valley a half-second later, flat and enormous, and a column of grey dust and pulverized stone climbed 200 feet into the March sky. My cattle scattered, 90 head running for the tree line like the ground itself had turned against them, which, in a way, it had. I stood there with my father's binoculars still up to my eyes, watching 200 feet of 11,000-year-old glacial till come down in about 4 seconds. And I thought about Ansel's pencil handwriting in that old will. Never touch the wall. It keeps us alive. That's when Marlene walked up in her white blazer and said the thing about rocks and views and nobody owning the Ice Age. That's when I started filming. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, "You're going to want to keep that receipt from your blasting contractor," and walked back to my truck. And she must have thought I meant something small, because she actually smiled at that, thinking she'd won something. I drove straight to the county annex in town and requested every record they had on file for Miller's Basin. Plat maps, easements, engineering surveys, flood classifications, going back to stated if they had them. The clerk, a heavy-set woman named Judy, who'd known my father, pulled 3 banker's boxes out of long-term storage that hadn't been opened, judging by the dust, since sometime in the Reagan administration. It took me 11 days of evenings at that annex, coffee going cold, reading glasses sliding down my nose, before I found what I was looking for. It was a 1974 Bureau of Reclamation cooperative survey, cross-filed with the County Engineer's Office, formally classifying the Millers Basin Terminal Moraine as a significant natural flood control feature protecting downstream residential development, complete with hydrological calculations estimating that an uncontrolled breach could release an estimated 40 acre-feet of impounded meltwater in a catastrophic surge event. Attached to it, stapled with a rusted staple that crumbled when I touched it, was a supplemental note from 1988, the year my father died, confirming the classification remained active and recommending it be incorporated into any future zoning or development review for the basin. Nobody had incorporated anything. The county had simply forgotten it existed, the same way everybody forgets things that have never once caused a problem, right up until they do. I found something else in that box too, something that made my hands go cold in a warm records room. The so-called 1998 Basin Vista View corridor easement that Marlene's letter cited did exist in the county's digital index, but when I pulled the actual recorded instrument, the notary stamp on it was dated 2019, not 1998. Someone had backdated a document and filed it recently, banking on the fact that nobody checks notary commission expiration dates against the claimed date of execution. A notary's commission in Colorado runs for a fixed term, and the commission number stamped on that easement hadn't even been issued by the Secretary of State until 2016. That's not a clerical error. That's forgery, plain and simple, the kind of thing that falls under CRS Section 18-5-102, and it meant the entire legal basis for the fine, the site assessment, and the blasting permit was built on a document that didn't exist when it claimed to. I sat in that records room until Judy told me she had to lock up, and I remember the exact time because I looked at my watch out of old habit, 5:47 p.m., and thought about how the number kept following me around that spring, like the mountain itself was keeping score. It was around then that I started hearing about Eleanor Kowalski. Ellie, everybody called her, 78 years old, widow of a Korean War Army medic, living alone in a little frame house on the eastern edge of the basin, with an oxygen concentrator humming in the corner of her living room and a service flag still hanging in her front window 20 years after her husband passed. The HOA had fined her, too, $400 for a unpermitted modification, which turned out to be a wooden wheelchair ramp her nephew had built for her the year her lungs got bad enough that she needed the tank most hours of the day. Marlene's board had sent Ellie a letter threatening a lien on a house that had been paid off since 1994 over a ramp that let a disabled widow get to her own mailbox. But it was what Marlene wanted from her that told me the real shape of the scheme. A Blue Water Ridge Holdings representative, not Marlene personally, always one step removed, had come to Ellie's door twice that February with an offer to help with her fines if she'd sign paperwork granting the HOA a maintenance and access easement across the back third of her lot, the part that ran along the same ridge as my property, the part with the best remaining view of Miller's Lake now that the moraine was gone. Ellie, God bless her, hadn't signed anything. She'd called her nephew instead, confused and a little frightened, and her nephew had called me, because everybody in Miller's Basin who didn't trust Marlene Cutter had started quietly finding their way to my porch that spring. That's when I stopped looking at this as a property dispute and started looking at it as a fraud case. I pulled the Colorado Secretary of State's business registry that same week and found Blue Water Ridge Holdings, LLC, registered in Wyoming, managing member listed as a paralegal in Cutter's own real estate office, with Marlene nowhere on the paperwork except as authorized consultant on a single amended filing from 14 months earlier, a filing she'd probably assumed nobody would ever bother reading. Cross-referencing property records, I found that Blue Water Ridge had quietly acquired options on 11 of the 12 premium lakefront lots over the previous 2 years, each one recorded just weeks before the HOA board, under Marlene's leadership, approved a community enhancement assessment that happened to raise the appraised value of exactly those parcels. The pre-sale contracts, which I got through a buyer who'd grown suspicious and shared his paperwork with me, showed $40,000 view premiums on all 12 lots, on top of base deposits running $60,000 to $90,000 each. I sat at my kitchen table one night in April with a calculator, Ansell's old table creaking under my elbows, and added it up slow, twice, because I didn't trust the number the first time. $3.2 million. Collected, banked, and sitting in accounts tied to a shell company built on a mountain wall that no longer existed, protecting homes that, come the first real thaw, were about to find out exactly why my great-grandfather's pencil handwriting had survived 4 generations without anybody ever daring to argue with it. Ellie Kowalski's oxygen delivery truck couldn't get up her driveway on the second Tuesday of April, 2:47 p.m. I know because her nephew called me 40 minutes later, voice shaking, and I checked my legal pad out of habit before I'd even hung up the phone. The Alpine Basin HOA had posted a notice 3 days earlier, citing an emergency drainage improvement that required temporary closure of the private access road running past 3 homes, including Ellie's. What they didn't post, what nobody found out until the delivery driver was already turning around in a stranger's driveway with 200 pounds of oxygen tanks Ellie needed to keep breathing, was that the drainage improvement consisted of a 6-foot berm of gravel and dirt that Marlene's contractor had pushed across the road with a skid steer, blocking it entirely, supposedly to redirect runoff from the newly exposed moraine scar toward a retention pond that didn't exist yet on paper or in the ground. Ellie's concentrator backup battery is rated for about 4 hours. Her nephew told me she'd been on it since morning because the power had flickered twice in the wind, and by the time he got the call from the delivery company saying they couldn't reach her, she had maybe 90 minutes left before that battery died. I got in my truck. I didn't call the sheriff first. I called Carl Voss instead and told him to meet me there with his phone camera ready, because I already knew, the way you know weather is coming before the sky changes, that whatever I found at that berm was going to matter more as evidence than as an emergency. It mattered as both. I got to Ellie's road at 3:31 p.m, her nephew already there, pacing beside his car, and I found the berm exactly as described, blocking a public utility easement that, I'd learn later, the county had never actually approved closing. I didn't touch it. I photographed it from 4 angles, time-stamped, then called the fire department's non-emergency medical line and explained the situation. Elderly resident, oxygen dependent, blocked access, ETA on backup power under an hour. They sent a truck around through a service road on the north side within 20 minutes and got a replacement tank to her with 11 minutes of battery left on her old one. I know because I stood in her living room afterward and she gripped my hand with fingers thin as bird bones and said, "Bobby Hatch, I always did like your father better than that woman." Which made me laugh, even though I wanted to put my fist through Marlene Cutter's clipboard. That was the first line Marlene crossed that I couldn't file away as merely infuriating. That was the line where this stopped being about my family's mountain and became about whether a 78-year-old widow lived or didn't, because a developer wanted a drainage feature that would raise property values on lots she'd already oversold 3 times. I still didn't go public. I still didn't call a reporter, didn't post anything online, didn't so much as raise my voice at the next HOA meeting I attended, sitting in the back row with my legal pad and a folder Carl had helped me build. Here's what most homeowners don't know. In a fraud case involving forged instruments and dangerous obstruction of emergency access, the worst thing you can do is tip your hand early. Every premature confrontation gives the other side time to shred documents, move money, or claim ignorance. What you want, if you're building something that will actually hold up, is documented, permitted, witnessed action on your side, and undocumented, impulsive, camera-catchable action on theirs. I'd spent 38 years reading failure analysis reports. I knew that dams don't fail because of one mistake. They fail because of a chain of small ones nobody stopped in time. I intended to be the thing that finally stopped this chain, and I intended to do it with paperwork so clean a jury wouldn't need more than an afternoon. So I got to work quietly. I filed, through Carl, a formal request with the county engineer's office to reclassify the Moraine site under its original 1974 flood control designation, attaching the Bureau of Reclamation survey I'd found, along with my own updated hydrological analysis. 38 years of dam failure work is good for something, and I spent 6 nights at my kitchen table running the numbers on Miller's Lake's spring melt volume against the now breached moraine, concluding, conservatively, that a normal thaw year would send an estimated flood surge of 18 to 22 acre-feet downhill within a 6 to 12-hour window, once temperatures held above 50 degrees for more than 3 consecutive days. I filed that analysis as a public safety notice, not a lawsuit, dated April 9th, delivered by certified mail to the county commissioners, the sheriff's office, the State Division of Water Resources, and, this part mattered, to Marlene Cutter personally as HOA president, return receipt requested. Under Colorado Revised Statutes Section 37-87-102, Dam Safety Authority for structures affecting public welfare falls under the State Engineer's Office, and a documented warning of imminent failure risk, once filed, creates a legal record that can't later be waved away as something nobody knew about. I wanted her signature on that green receipt card. I wanted the date stamped. I wanted, more than anything else, a paper trail proving she'd been told, in writing, with hydrology attached, exactly what was coming, and that she'd ignored it. She did ignore it. Worse than that, she escalated. 9 days after my notice went out, on a Thursday afternoon with the temperature sitting at 56 degrees for the 4th day running, close enough to my threshold that I'd already started checking the lake gauge twice a day, I got a call from a man named Pete Alvarez, a retired county surveyor who lived on the ridge above the breach and who'd become, over the past month, one of the quiet network of neighbors feeding the information Marlene never knew was flowing my way. Pete told me 2 things. First, that Blue Water Ridge Holdings had just closed on the sale of 2 more premium lakefront lots that morning, wiring an additional $412,000 in closing proceeds through the shell company, bringing total collected funds close to that $3.2 million mark I'd calculated back in April. Second, and this was the part that made me grab my truck keys, that Marlene's contractor was back at the breach site with a bolt cutter and a chain, cutting through the temporary safety fencing the county had ordered installed around the exposed moraine scar after my hazard filing, so she could run a survey crew through to stake 2 more lots before the closure notice made buyers nervous. I drove up with my phone already recording, propped in a dash mount, because I've learned that if you're going to witness something, you witness it in a way nobody can later claim was staged or selectively edited. I parked at a distance, walked up along the county access road, which was public right-of-way, meaning I had every legal right to stand there, and got there in time to film Marlene herself, in a grey designer skirt suit entirely wrong for a construction site, standing beside her contractor while he cut the last padlock off the safety fencing the county had bolted in place 5 days earlier. A fence with a bright orange placard zip-tied to it, reading, "Danger. Unstable slope, county order," in letters big enough to read from 40 yards away, which is exactly the distance I stood filming from with a zoom lens on my phone. She looked straight at me while he cut the chain. She didn't even flinch. "This is still my development, Mr. Hatch," she called out. "A county placard doesn't override a homeowner's right to access their own investment. Except it wasn't her investment. It was land inside my deeded boundary, on a slope the county had legally closed under emergency order pursuant to CRS Section 30-28-121. And cutting a county-ordered safety enclosure is a Class 2 misdemeanor under state law, before you even get to the federal wire fraud implications of that morning's $412,000 closing. I didn't say any of that to her face. I just kept the camera rolling, got clean audio of her voice claiming the access, got her contractor's face and his truck's license plate, and texted the video, unedited, straight to Carl Voss and to Deputy Ruiz, the same deputy who'd been too late to stop the original blast, along with a message. Second felony level violation on video, timestamped, county fencing cut in progress. Requesting response before crew enters unstable zone. I also, quietly, that same evening, filed a formal written notice with the State Division of Water Resources, invoking my rights as the deeded owner of a classified flood control structure under CRS Section 37-87-105, requesting immediate emergency authorization to begin remedial reconstruction of the breach. A request that, if granted, would put the State Engineer's Office, a state trooper if necessary, and eventually the whole apparatus of Colorado water law between Marlene Cutter and anything else she thought she still controlled on that mountain. The lake gauge that night read 41 degrees at the surface and rising. Somewhere above the breach, 11,000 years of frozen wait was starting for the first time since Ansel Hatch was a young man with a homestead claim and a dream to move. The thaw broke on a Saturday, first week of May, temperature holding at 61 degrees for the third straight day, and I woke that morning at 5:30 with a feeling in my gut I hadn't had since I stood on that failed Louisiana levee years back. I drove up to the lake gauge before the sun cleared the ridge and watched the water sitting 4 inches from a level I'd calculated back in April as the point where the unsupported breach would start moving material on its own, gravity doing what dynamite had started. I'd already done everything the law allowed me to do. The State Engineer's Office had approved my emergency remedial authorization 11 days earlier, and I'd spent that time, along with a crew of contractors and 2 of my own hands, building a temporary rock and gabion barrier across the breach, engineered properly this time, permitted, inspected, with a state dam safety officer named Louise Tran signing off on every stage. What I hadn't done was tell Marlene Cutter any of it, because under my authorization, I didn't need her permission to protect my own deeded flood control structure, and I wanted her finding out the same way everybody else in Miller's Basin was about to find out, in public, on the record, with cameras rolling. The county called an emergency HOA and homeowners meeting for that Saturday afternoon at 2:47 p.m. I hadn't chosen the time, the county clerk had, and when I saw it on the notice, I actually laughed out loud, sitting alone at Ansel's table, because some numbers just decide to follow you. The meeting was held in the community centre, folding chairs packed wall to wall, sheriff's deputies posted at the back doors because word had gotten around that something was coming, a reporter from the Gunnison paper in the second row with a notepad, and Louise Tran from the State Engineer's Office sitting up front with a folder of her own. Marlene arrived 11 minutes late in her white Range Rover, wearing a navy suit this time, clipboard in hand like always, and she started the meeting the way she started every meeting, talking over the murmur of the crowd like she was the only person in the room whose voice mattered. "I understand there's been some concern about recent water levels," she said, "but I want to assure everyone that the HOA has this well in hand, and any claims otherwise are coming from a disgruntled property owner with a personal grudge against progress." That's when Deputy Ruiz stood up at the back, and Louise Tran stood up at the front, and I stood up from my folding chair in the third row, still in my work boots because I'd come straight from the barrier site, mud still on my jeans. "Ms. Cutter," I said, "I'd like to enter into the record the emergency flood control authorization granted to me by the State Engineer's Office on April the 29th, along with the 1974 Bureau of Reclamation classification of the Miller's Basin Moraine as a protected flood control structure on my deeded land, which your HOA destroyed without permit, notice, or my consent on March the 3rd at 2:47 p.m. The room went dead quiet. Marlene's smile didn't move for a second, like it hadn't caught up to what I'd said. That easement predates." "There is no easement," Carl Voss said, standing up beside me with a folder of his own. The Basin Vista View Corridor easement your board cited in Mr. Hatch's fine notice was notarized using a commission number the Colorado Secretary of State didn't issue until 2016, backdated to claim a 1998 execution date. That's forgery of a government instrument, Ms. Cutter, and we've already provided that documentation to the district attorney's office. I watched something happen to her face I'd been waiting 2 months to see. Not anger, fear, arriving late and all at once. The particular look of someone realizing the floor they've been standing on was never actually there. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, voice climbing. "I was advised by counsel that—" "Ma'am," Deputy Ruiz said, walking up the center aisle now. "We also have you on video April 18th cutting a county-ordered safety fence around a designated hazard zone, which is a violation of Colorado Revised Statute 30-28-121. And the DA's office has been in contact with the State Financial Crimes Unit regarding Blue Water Ridge holdings and roughly $3.2 million in pre-sale deposits collected on properties tied to that fence, that fraudulent easement, and a hazard your own board was formally warned about in writing on April the 9th. Right about then, through the community center's big front windows, everybody in that room saw the county's emergency management truck pull up outside, lights flashing, and heard, distant but unmistakable, the low mechanical groan of water moving somewhere it shouldn't be moving yet. Not the flood itself, not that day, but the sound of Miller's Lake pressing hard against a temporary barrier that hadn't existed a month earlier. The sound of exactly what I'd spent 38 years learning to predict. Marlene Cutter stood up so fast her clipboard clattered off her chair and onto the floor, papers sliding out across the tile in front of the whole room, in front of the reporter, in front of Ellie Kowalski, who I hadn't even noticed sitting near the front until that moment, oxygen tank beside her chair, watching with an expression I can only describe as pure, quiet satisfaction. Marlene bent to grab the papers, and Deputy Ruiz was there before she straightened back up. "Marlene Cutter," he said, "you're under arrest on outstanding warrants for forgery of a government document under 18-5-102 and criminal mischief related to the fence cutting on April 18th. The Financial Crimes Unit will be following up separately regarding the LLC filings." He read her rights right there in front of 300 of her own homeowners, the clipboard still lying on the floor with its papers scattered, nobody moving to pick them up. The verdict came 7 months later, after a plea deal that spared the county a trial nobody particularly wanted, given how thoroughly the paper trail already spoke for itself. Marlene Cutter pleaded guilty to felony forgery, criminal mischief, and 1 count of securities fraud tied to the unregistered sale of investment interests through Blue Water Ridge Holdings. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, ordered to pay $3.2 million in restitution to the defrauded lot buyers, and permanently barred from serving on any homeowners association board or real estate licensing capacity in the state of Colorado. Her Range Rover, her house, and every asset traceable to Blue Water Ridge got seized under the restitution order, which covered maybe 60% of what buyers had actually lost once legal fees and interest were factored in. The rest came out of a bonding claim against the HOA's insurance carrier, which is a mess still working through the courts as of this telling. Her paralegal, the nominal managing member of the LLC, took a lesser plea and testified against her in exchange for 18 months probation. The blasting contractor lost his state license for detonating explosives without a proper geotechnical review and paid a $40,000 fine. The county engineer's office got a formal reprimand for letting a 50-year-old flood classification gather dust instead of cross-checking it against new development permits. And the state has since required, under updated regulations, that any HOA-approved land alteration within a designated flood control zone get sign-off from the Division of Water Resources before a single permit is issued. As for me, the state approved permanent reconstruction of the moraine that summer, engineered properly this time under my own design, with real drainage channels and a rated spillway instead of 11,000 years of accidental perfection. paid for out of the restitution fund because it was, legally and finally, recognised as exactly what Ansel Hatch always called it, a wall that keeps us alive. I stood up there in late September, boots in the dirt, watching the last truckload of engineered riprap get placed along the crown. And Ellie Kowalski came up the access road in her nephew's truck to watch, oxygen tank riding in the back seat, the basin's new HOA president badge pinned crooked to her cardigan, because the homeowners had voted her in unanimously 2 weeks after Marlene's arrest. And the first thing Ellie did in that role was refund every fine the old board had ever issued against a fixed-income resident, and rewrite the covenants so no HOA in Miller's Basin could ever again claim an easement over land it hadn't legitimately purchased. That evening, I sat at Ansel's old table with the window open, the smell of cut hay and diesel drifting up from the barn. And underneath it, for the first time in months, that clean, mineral cold breath of glacial water, back where it belonged, held exactly where it needed to be held. I thought about what I'd tell my own grandkids someday, if I ever had them sit at this table the way I once did. That paperwork outlasts bullies. That the law moves slow, but it moves true, if you feed it the right documents at the right time. And that some inheritances aren't land or money at all. They're the patience to wait for the thaw, and the sense to be ready when it comes. 3 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from a downstream water district 40 miles south, asking, very politely, whether I'd be willing to review some troubling gaps in their own dam safety records. I poured myself coffee, sat down at Ansel's table, and started reading. I sat there for a long moment before I opened it, turning the envelope over in my hands, feeling the weight of the letterhead through the paper. Cottonwood Water Conservation District. I knew the name. 40 miles south, a valley I'd driven through 100 times without ever thinking much about what was holding the water back on either side of the road. Before I opened it, my mind went back to that morning in September, standing at the crown of the rebuilt moraine with Louise Tran, the two of us watching the county inspection crew run their final measurements. She turned to me, clipboard in hand, a different kind of clipboard than Marlene's, I remember thinking, one that actually meant something, and said, "You know, Bob, there's probably a dozen structures like this one scattered across this state. Old, forgotten, sitting on somebody's private land, doing a job nobody remembers assigning them." I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I'd been too tired, too relieved, too busy watching the water sit calm and contained behind engineered stone instead of accidental glacial luck. But sitting at Ansel's table with that cottonwood letter in my hands, her words came back to me, clear as the day she'd said them. Ellie stopped by that same week, her nephew driving her up in the afternoon light, oxygen tank humming quietly in the back seat the way it always did now, like something you stop noticing after a while, the same way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. She sat across from me at the table, and I made her tea the way she liked it, too much sugar, the way her husband used to make it for her, back when he was still breathing on his own. "You look like a man with something on his mind," she said, sharp as ever, despite the cannula running under her nose. "Got a letter," I said, and slid it across to her. She read it slow, her lips moving slightly, the way older folk sometimes do, and then she looked up at me over her glasses. "Well," she said, "are you going to go?" "Don't know yet." "Bobby Hatch." She said my name the way my late wife used to, when she already knew the answer and just wanted to hear me admit it out loud. "You've been sitting on this porch for 6 months looking like a man who solved a puzzle he didn't want solved. You built that wall back up out of spite and grief and love for your granddaddy, and now you're going to sit here and pretend you don't want to know what else is out there." I didn't answer her right away. I looked out the window instead, past the barn, up toward the ridge where the new moraine sat solid and permanent under the autumn light, doing exactly what it was built to do 11,000 years ago, and exactly what it would keep doing for another 11,000 if people just left it alone this time. "I keep thinking about Marlene," I said finally, not with any sympathy, mind you, but about how she never once stopped to ask why that wall was there before she decided to blow it up. Just saw something old and inconvenient and figured it didn't matter because she didn't understand it. That's the whole trouble with people like her. Ellie said, setting her tea down with a small, deliberate click against the table's old, worn surface. They mistake not understanding something for that something not mattering. I thought about the cottonwood letter sitting between us, about the dozen structures Louise Tran said might be scattered across the state, quietly holding back a chain of somebody else's water. Waiting for the day some HOA board or developer decided a premium view lot was worth more than 11,000 years of geology minding its own business. I suppose I ought to go take a look, I said. Ellie smiled, the kind of smile that had probably steadied a lot of nervous soldiers' families over the decades, and reached across the table to pat my hand, with fingers still thin as bird bones, but a good deal steadier now than they'd been that April afternoon on her oxygen backup. Good, she said. Somebody around here needs to keep an eye on the walls nobody else remembers building.